I've entitled these thoughts, Life Affirming Connection. And we'll be looking at one of my favorite of Jesus' encounters that's recorded only in Luke's Gospel, chapter 19. What comes to mind when you hear the word connection? In my parents' generation, one of the biggest transformations to their lifestyle occurred sometime in the late 1940s when they became connected to the electrical grid. For myself, I well remember the change to our family's life when our farm was finally connected to the phone system in the 1960s. Electricity and telephone continue to be important connections, but today the connection we're continually looking for is Wi-Fi along with cell phone coverage. As one who had grown up without electricity, my mother used to caution me to not take electricity for granted. But like most people, I do take my connection to electricity for granted until there's a power failure. No matter where we look in life, connections are important to all of us, and we can't afford to take them for granted. Maybe that's why Zacchaeus is in my personal list of favorite Bible stories. The appeal of Zacchaeus is not only in the image of a short man climbing up a tree to enable him to see Jesus, though you have to admit there are a few stories in the Bible which are more fun to act out than the story of Zacchaeus. Apart from the visual appeal of the story, Zacchaeus' visit from Jesus has theological interest because it offers a process of salvation that's different from the picture of salvation that is commonly proclaimed. I used to think that the only picture of salvation offered in the Bible was Jesus talking to Nicodemus, where Jesus told Nicodemus that he had to be born again. Because of Jesus' well-known interaction with Nicodemus, it has become accepted within many Christian circles to use the phrase born again as the key identifier of God's salvation. Unless people claim to be born again, they might not be accepted as fellow followers of Jesus. And yet in this story where Jesus emphatically proclaimed that salvation had come to Zacchaeus' house, there is no mention of being born again. How then do we describe the process of salvation as it's portrayed in the story of Zacchaeus, according to Luke 19, verses 1 to 10? This is how the encounter went, which again, as I said, is only described by Luke. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Take note that Jesus emphatically proclaimed that today salvation has come to this house, without any talk of Zacchaeus being born again. If there is no mention of being born again, what was the process of salvation in Zacchaeus' story? Unlike his interaction with Nicodemus, Jesus didn't preach at Zacchaeus, but Jesus did make a point of connecting with Zacchaeus. At least, we have no evidence that Jesus preached at Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus may well have heard Jesus' sermons in other places, but This might be the only time that Jesus visited Jericho. On that particular day in Jericho, Jesus simply walked over to the tree where Zacchaeus was hanging out, pun intended, and announced to him that the two of them were going to connect in an intimate way. "I've got to stay at your house," Jesus said. Everybody who heard Jesus' words grumbled, and it's no wonder. By staying in Zacchaeus' house, it appeared as if Jesus was endorsing Zacchaeus' wrong actions. How could Jesus stay in a house which to them represented a center of evil in their community? That's the kind of reaction any of us can have. Too often we avoid connecting with people about whose behavior we disagree because we don't want to endorse their bad behavior. Jesus had no such sentiments. Unlike our typical human reactions, Jesus was able to separate endorsement from connection. Connecting for Jesus meant being there for someone else regardless of their character. The important result was that because Jesus purposefully connected with Zacchaeus, salvation came to Zacchaeus' house. As we consider this story, we see important lessons of how God connects with us, and just as importantly, how we can connect with others. We are challenged to think carefully of our own life situations because the story of Jesus and Zacchaeus makes it clear that we should not expect that life-altering connections happen automatically. Let's look at some elements of how Jesus connected with Zacchaeus. One of the first things we notice is that Jesus deliberately entered Zacchaeus' space. People make jokes about a come to Jesus moment. And even in serious theological circles, we talk about coming to Jesus. Yes, Zacchaeus climbed a tree to see Jesus, but it's noteworthy that Jesus came to Zacchaeus. Before you think this is too obvious, consider carefully. We can't overestimate the impact of this simple action, but neither can we diminish the sensitivity that's required. When we enter another person's space, we either become their guests or their invaders. You know the difference from personal experience. There are people who come into our lives with what feels like the purpose of taking over our lives. They want to make their agenda our agenda. If we want to go for pizza, they insist on going for Chinese. You might not even be sure why they are part of your life because we don't remember inviting them in. I learned the importance of this when I took a course in pastoral care. I was assigned a few patients to visit on a weekly basis in a palliative care facility in Winnipeg. In the process of preparing to visit, we were given specific instructions of how to connect with patients. Among those instructions, we were emphatically told to never barge into a patient's room uninvited. Ever since then, I am careful when I visit in a hospital or a care home to knock on the door, even if it's open, and to wait for an acknowledgement or an invitation to enter. For so many people, when they are admitted to an institution, they feel as if they leave their personal dignity at the door and that they have no private life left. By not entering their room without an invitation, we were taught to treat their room as if it was their home, with the goal of helping them maintain personal dignity. Jesus' interaction with Zacchaeus proved that if we want to connect with people, they have to see us as guests and not invaders. Being a guest instead of an invader takes careful thought in how we treat other people. Jesus didn't inwardly take note of Zacchaeus up in the tree and then later crash his house unannounced. Instead, Jesus approached Zacchaeus ahead of time, and we can tell by Zacchaeus' reaction that Jesus was a welcome guest and not an invader. Jesus doesn't invade anybody's life. A hallmark of Jesus' relationships is that they resulted from an invitation. That's why the famous words in Revelation 3:20 have so much meaning. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person and they with me. God understands that we love guests and not so much. We might even despise invaders. Jesus didn't only enter Zacchaeus' space, Jesus inspired positive change. People are often afraid of a connection with God because of the demands they assume God will make. And none of us like people who make unwelcome demands. That's why we do appreciate call display. We didn't have call display in our home until much later than most people, and after we had it, I didn't know how I had previously survived without being able to avoid a connection with demanding telemarketers. An amazing aspect of Jesus' encounter with Zacchaeus is that there's no evidence that Jesus told Zacchaeus what he needed to do. We might expect, and maybe all those people who grumbled at Jesus going to the house of a sinner hoped, that Jesus would sit him down and hold the threat of eternal retribution over Zacchaeus. Instead, we end up being surprised that Zacchaeus' reaction followed no prescribed formula. Jesus didn't tell Zacchaeus to give away half of his possessions and to repay people 4 times what he might have overcharged them. Zacchaeus made those decisions on his own. Change is most powerful when it's a personal choice and not a dictated demand. The beauty of Zacchaeus' response was that not only was it entirely personal and unpredictable, but it was the kind of change that only results from a meaningful and personal connection. We should not fail to notice that gracious connections produce positive change. A final element of this encounter, which we must not fail to notice, is that Jesus celebrated Zacchaeus' decision. When Jesus witnessed Zacchaeus' life-changing decisions, it sounded like he was ready to party. Today, salvation has come to this house. There was genuine joy in those words. And if God celebrates our successes, we are free to celebrate boldly other successes, even our own. I love the fact that Jesus demonstrated that a key element of connecting with people is celebrating with them. If we feel like we have a hard time connecting with people, a good way to begin is by looking for opportunities to give people a pat on the back and to affirm their efforts. One of the best ways to start to build connections with people is to find ways to congratulate them, to celebrate their successes with them. The story of Zacchaeus and Jesus leads us to conclude that salvation is a connection with God that leaves us powerfully enabled. Salvation isn't about meeting a list of demands. Salvation is about discovering a connection with God that results in a personal experience of positive change. And yes, that change often looks like a new birth, like being born again, because the new Zacchaeus was hardly recognizable from the old Zacchaeus. That's what connections can accomplish. The very best connections we make result in salvation from self-destructive inclinations.